So, before I really kind of get into the sermon, one of the things that I wanted to say was that if there's ever any time when I'm preaching a sermon and I kind of hit on something that you hear and you keep thinking about, and basically you find yourself wrestling with, and you keep thinking about it and you just don't really get any resolution, and like to come back to me and talk to me about it, either say, preacher, I think you got that one a little off, or you might be a little wrong on that, or just kind of want to come and ask a few questions. I really like that part of church. So if you have any questions, feel free to get hold of me. Let's see, I think my cell phone is on the front part of the bulletin. And if you ever need to call me up and ask anything or wrestle about anything with me, you're more than invited to ring me. So with that said, for today's message, we find ourselves in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16 to 18. And one of the things that is interesting about this book of 2 Timothy is that when we look at it, and when people who kind of study the Bible as a profession, when those scholars look at it, they realize that there's really not much that we know about this passage, about this entire book. And first of all, we're not sure when Paul was writing this. And in the passage that we have today, he talks about a trial that he's been through. So going up before somebody and deciding if he's guilty or not. And for Paul, you can just kind of expect that this trial was centered around where he just would not stop preaching the gospel. And sometimes people didn't want that, and so they sent him to court and put him up on trial for that. And so when people try to pin down a moment in Paul's ministry where it's likely that this could have been written, those scholars that study this text say that, well, it might be the case that he's writing about that trial that we see in Acts chapter 23, verse 1 to 11, where Paul's in Jerusalem and he's coming before the religious leaders there and basically asking them some questions and going through that that trial, that thing that really kind of characterizes Paul's ministry. And so when people are trying to pin down a time in Paul's life where this letter might have been written, it could have been at that time. Or if it wasn't during that time, if it wasn't at that moment, it could have been at a later trial that Paul is experiencing. In that case, Paul could have been writing this passage as he was going through a current trial. And so as we try to pin down a moment when this could have been written, we realize that it's very hard. And not only is it hard to pin down a moment in Paul's ministry, a certain year, but when scholars look at this, they also have problems trying to even decide whether or not Paul is the actual author of this. Because for a large group of scholars, they say that, well, it could have been the case that Paul did not write this. But even though Paul might not have written this, practically everybody agrees that whoever wrote this knew Paul very well. And whoever wrote this knew about Paul's intimate experience of Christ throughout his ministry. And that whoever wrote this could write about all these ideas of the Christian faith as somebody who experienced Christ personally and experienced the power of God throughout their own discipleship and throughout their own ministry. And so while people kind of struggle, debating whether or not it was Paul that wrote this text, when you think about it, you kind of have to ask the question, does it really even matter? But when we look at this passage for today, you're going to hear me kind of talking about Paul writing in this passage and Paul writing to Timothy. Because for the person who wrote this text, that was the idea that they wanted us to walk away from. Was that in this moment it was a mentor writing to his mentee. It was a seasoned disciple of Christ writing to somebody who still had a ways to go in their discipleship. And when you read this passage, the image that you get is that Paul is in prison. And all things considered, he's in pretty good spirits about his situation because, whenever you look back to passages like chapter 4, verses 6 to 8, he's not kidding himself about the situation that he's in. And you see him write, "As for me, I've already been poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not only to me, but also all who have longed for his appearing." And so in this moment, Paul is fairly realistic that he doesn't have all that much time left. And that it's very likely that within the next hour, the next few hours, and the next few days, that there's a good chance that he might be executed for his faith and his commitment to the gospel. And as he's writing this letter to his mentee, as he's writing to Timothy, he wants to take the wisdom that he's picking up in this experience and pass it on to his young friend. Because in this moment, what he's learning about the Christian life and discipleship is that as you progress in Christian discipleship and grow as a follower of Christ, there's a good chance that the people who were around you at one time will probably abandon you later on. That even though you have a lot of support at one stage in your life, that's not necessarily always going to be the case. And we see in this letter that Paul's learning this. As he looks around and he sees that all the people who were with him throughout his ministry around the Mediterranean, when he was kind of jumping from island to island spreading the gospel, that all those people that were near him and so committed to him during that time, supporting his ministry, aren't necessarily there anymore. And in fact, of all the people who traveled with him, Luke is the only one still around. Everybody else has run off. And so as Paul's reflecting on this situation, it occurs to him that because of our commitment to the gospel, we are likely going to find ourselves in a position where we're abandoned. And where as we keep trying to serve the gospel and trying to serve the kingdom of God, there's going to be a good chance that one day we're going to look around and we're going to find ourselves alienated. And now whenever I kind of picked up on this message that Paul's including in this letter, I myself, had to wrestle with it a little bit. Because here Paul's telling us that, as a disciple of Christ, it's very likely that, you're going to experience exclusion. And that because of, your status as a Christian, there just aren't going to be a lot of people around you. And that was hard for me to hear because it's just, it conflicts so much with my experience with the Christian faith. Because in my own experience with the church and other Christians, I've actually experienced a lot of inclusion because of my faith. And specifically, I can think back to my time in the high school youth group. When I was a junior or senior, and I started to get involved with, the youth group of the big church in the town where I was living. And, just to kind of get an idea of what this youth group was like, whenever you pulled up to the church, there were people inside the church, milling around a few minutes before worship. But right before, the music started and, the youth minister started to preach, which were all amazing parts of the service. The youth minister always gave a thoughtful message and would go through and explain a part of Scripture to us, or even sometimes just set us down and teach us something about the nature of God. And on top of that, there's also this youth band. And so every Wednesday, they would have these performances and it'd always just be wonderful music. And it was always the case where you could sing along to the hymns and worship along with this band. And again, it was all very meaningful. And I can sit back and look and say that all that was very influential to my development as a Christian. But while all of that was so very good, there's also this other piece to it. Because like you see whenever you drive up to this church, again, while there are people inside the church, milling around just before service, there's also a large group of people in the parking lot hanging out. And so some of the people in the parking lot, were people that you would recognize from week to week, and people who were committed to this ministry and who would always be there worshiping, participating, and praying. But since there was such a large amount of high schoolers there, what you would also see was people who would just kind of drive up and hang out, the boyfriends or girlfriends of the regulars, and they'd just spend time because that's where all their friends were. And as somebody who came week after week to this thing, I noticed that over time I started to accumulate friends. And I started to forge relationships with people that I had not previously known. And toward the end of my senior year in high school, I was able to look back and see all these different friendships that I had with people in all these different high schools around the county. And all those friendships came about because of my participation in this youth group. And so while Paul's talking about, how we can expect to experience exclusion and abandonment because of our commitment to the gospel, my own experience kind of conflicts with that. Because I experienced a lot of inclusion. It was a very welcoming experience. And it was a pretty nice thing to be a follower of Christ. It wasn't that hard. And whenever I think about this, it's easy to kind of write it off and say, well, that was a high school youth group and things are different as you get older. But as I thought about it, that's not necessarily the case. Because church kind of maintains that same spirit where it's a lot of people getting together and praising God and worshiping God and giving thanks for our salvation. But since there are so many people there, that some people just see it as a social opportunity. And so in a lot of these churches, you'll see people show up who aren't necessarily interested in the Bible or their relationship with God, or have no interest in any aspect of their faith, really. But that's where everybody's at. And you see this especially clearly whenever it's election season. And because these churches are where everybody's at on a Sunday, what you'll see is these politicians coming around and visiting and shaking people's hands because there's a lot of inclusion in the Christian faith. And you'll see that in other ways where, I've witnessed this during different church services where, in the passing of the peace, people will stand up and meet other people, and sometimes they'll pull out a business card and say, well, if you ever have any need, feel free to call me. And so again, for some people, church is a great place to make business connections. And despite Paul telling us that through our commitment to the Christian faith, we're going to experience alienation and exclusion, again, I kind of have to push back on this and say, that's not necessarily been the case for me. Now, what I've seen in the Christian faith, it's a great way to get plugged in. It's a great way to meet people and, kind of cultivate all these different relationships. But even though I have that temptation to push back against what Paul's saying, I also have to recognize that he's right. Because it is the case where, as we mature in our faith, the people that were around us at one point might not be there further on down the line. And so, well, at one point in your life, the highest form of Christian discipleship that you experience is, singing a praise song, and which is very sincere, which, is how at that moment you're praising God. As you develop in your faith and you grow closer and closer to Christ and get better at emulating the life of Christ in your own life, what you see is that things kind of start to amp up gradually and gradually. And so where the height of your worship might be, singing a praise song, you start to grow into maybe going out and talking to somebody who you would have never expected that you would. You keep growing, and it might get to the point where you start to sacrifice parts of yourself that you would have never expected to give up. And as you keep growing, as you keep drawing closer and closer to Christ, what you see is that you're always learning how to love more radically. And this is something that Paul experienced. And as he's writing to Timothy, he wants to be very upfront with him and say that as you grow in this aspect of your faith, and as you keep living more and more radically, more and more faithfully to the example that Christ sets, don't be discouraged if one day you look around and nobody's there. Because again, for Paul, this is probably the end of his life, and the only person who's there with him is Luke. And you can expect that Luke is even a little shaky about Paul. And whenever Paul writes about this idea of, his trial and his experience with that, one of the things that he's quick to point out is that even though nobody was standing there with him, that group of friends that he had was now gone. Even though that was the case, he could still take a lot of comfort because Christ was there with him. Even though he didn't have 9 or 10 advocates, his best friends, he had the best advocate that we could ever hope for. As he was on trial, Christ was there on trial with him. Basically giving Jesus his stamp of approval. And for Paul, it kind of sounds a little delusional how much comfort he takes in this idea, but it's very reassuring to him. Because whenever he looks around, it occurs to him that it's okay to be abandoned in ministry. Because wherever you are, Christ is there with you. Christ, the person who will set you free from any physical or spiritual confinement. Who Paul says will rescue me from every evil attack and save me for his heavenly kingdom. And so the idea is that whenever Timothy's reading this, He knows what to expect. And when we read it, Paul's letting us know what to expect further down the line. But the underlying message that Paul's giving us is that even when things get hard, don't allow all that adversity to kind of cause you to back off the gospel. Instead, even when it feels like you're out there on a limb by yourself, keep pushing forward. And always keep pushing forward. Because when you look around and you don't see anybody there with you, it is always the case that you have that company of Jesus with you. Which is amazing news because, in all reality, Jesus is all the company that we really need.